Hello everyone, this is Al Fadi and I want to welcome you back to another video of our new series on the search for Muhammad. We've been talking about some of the problems that are basically being uncovered, which contradict the traditional historical information that we have about Muhammad, for instance, or Mecca, or even other things related to the origin of Islam. Today we're going to continue along this line, and we're going to take a look at two important parts of the history of Muhammad. One, for instance, has to do with the so-called the Hijrah, where the Islamic calendar basically started it when supposedly Muhammad and Abu Bakr left Mecca because they were being persecuted and there was a threat to assassinate him, and left at night, left his cousin Ali in bed, and went to a cave, and and a spider basically covered that cave and protected them, and that's why we have a chapter on a spider. But nevertheless, Muhammad ended up basically going to Medina, and that started what we call the Islamic calendar. In fact, if you want to look at the Islamic date is totally different. It's 1400 plus. Why? Because that basically commemorate the date when Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina. And then we're going to look about another thing that has to do with the name Mecca itself. So I'm going to let, of course, no other than Dr. J. Smith to unpack these two problems for us. Dr. J, thank you again for being here with us.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you so much.
What's going on with the Hijrah and also Mecca?
Okay, well, here we got, and this is fascinating because when we talk about the Hijrah, we're talking about the Abbasid view of the Hijrah versus what really did happen in 622. By the time the Abbasids finally write this down, they have a whole different narrative than what actually did happen in 622. Now, you know what happened in 622. In 622 is when Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, comes and destroys the Sassanians, who had been the oppressors of the Arabs, mostly all Christians, and of course, some of them are Persian, but they are mostly the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids. These are the people that were under the oppression of the Sassanids, and that's why when Heraclius destroys them, he destroys this oppression. That became a huge year, and that's when haven't got to him yet, but Ilyas ibn Qabisa comes into the picture, because he is the one that actually changes his allegiance and actually supports then the Arabs. And that's when you see what's happening in the 7th century. But that's not the story we get by the 9th and 10th century, 200 to 300 years later. This story has this Muhammad that they have now created as their prophet to give that identity in the prophetic line. This is when he's moved from a city called Mecca to Medina. And of course, they point to that event. In chapter 2, looking at this same idea. But let's go back and let's go to the slide and let's start bringing this up. So let's open the slide, and there you have the first reference. Now, it's fascinating. You don't have any reference to the Hijrah, which means movement. It means like an exodus, doesn't it?
Right.
The word itself.
That's where you get the word muhajirin or muhajirun.
People of the Hijrah.
Exactly.
Un means plural,
who
masculine.
migrated. Yeah.
They migrated. The people who were migrated, which is fascinating because the muhajirun is a reference to the 7th century. The Arabs would call themselves muhajirun, and these would be nomadic people, the people who are always moving from place to place to place. The muhajirun, the people who are moving. That word then is now implied and it's first written down by Ibn Ishaq. Hold on a minute. Didn't we just talk about Ibn Ishaq earlier?
Yep.
How do we know that Ibn Ishaq wrote this down?
Well, I mean, we
found
out that Ibn Ishaq wrote it later.
We have nothing about Ibn Ishaq. So actually, it's Ibn Hisham that actually writes this down. It is Ibn Hisham who then introduces this in the 833. That's the 9th century. Let's go back to the slide again. So Ibn Hisham has to rewrite what he says was written by Ibn Ishaq. Obviously, this is now the narrative that the Abbasids want you to believe. During the Abbasid era. Remember, I said over and over again in these episodes, we're going to come to the Abbasid era because the Abbasids really have a narrative that is different than that which precedes. And this happens, listen, this is nothing new. This happens all the time. You have two different groups of people that are at war with each other. They hate each other. Finally, one has ascendancy over the other, and that person then, the ones who have ascendancy then they usually create their own capital. Well, isn't it interesting? The Abbasids they don't want to live in Damascus. They're from the Persian background. They want to live in what used to be Ctesiphon, then becomes Baghdad. and they introduce Baghdad as their capital. Now, this is given its name in the 9th century. Nonetheless, they now bring their capital down to Iraq. Not Syria, it's now Iraq. But they absolutely hate everything that has happened because for 100 years they've been under the oppression of these Umayyads living up there in Damascus. So what do? Well, they destroy all the stories that aggrandize the Umayyads, and they introduce their own story. That's why Ibn Ishaq then starts to introduce their own prophet, and he's the one to first write that down. But we don't have Ibn Ishaq, we only have Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham finally writes the credentialized story, the narrative that has become the official narrative. Later on, another 40 years, then you get the traditions concerning the sayings of the prophet. 600,000 of these sayings are whittled down to 7,397. 98% are thrown out, only 2 are returned by al-Bukhari. What happened to those 98%? I would love to be able to read them because I think an awful lot of those 98% include all these original stories from the Umayyad period, which is really probably what say an awful lot about Ilyas ibn Qabisa. We're going to get to that when we get to Ibn Qabisa because al-Bukhari does mention him, though it's a deformation of his name. Let's get back now to the Hijrah. Let's go back to the slide again. They're hated by the Abbasids. They eradicate the history of the Umayyads, and they include their own history, their own references to these battles. That's the battles you see al-Waqidi is introducing. Now, what's fascinating, they introduce a lot of their new stories surrounding their Prophet Muhammad, including this story of 622. Because they need this to give him a handle for himself in the 7th century. But instead of referring to the defeat of the Persians by the Byzantines, they don't want that part in there. What do? They create a new narrative around Muhammad of having him move from one city to the other instead. That fits now, suddenly, this character moving out. Murad was really good. Murad, the guy from Middle East, he speaks and he reads Arabic and Aramaic, and he's going back and he's saying, take a look, and you will see that when you look at all these traditions that are in the Quran, if you look at these traditions, have you noticed that they all take they take an awful lot of the same stories, the biblical prophets, and they apply it to Muhammad. So a lot of things that happened to him.
There's an interesting one you're going to allude to right now, and I'll elaborate further when you mention it.
Go ahead. On the Moses?
I mean, yes, about the entry, the triumphant entry of Muhammad into Medina.
So who do you think that is actually modeled on?
Well, of course, Jesus entered into Jerusalem, and I tell you why. It dawned on me when I realized that they were using basically palm, branches. Technically speaking, that's exactly what happened when Jesus entered into Jerusalem.
So if you are trying to recreate in your prophet many of the things that have come from before, from the other prophets, and you want him to be the seal of the prophets, you want him to be the greatest of all prophets, don't you take these stories that you have borrowed already in the Quran, they're already in the Quran, and you then take the same stories and you aggrandize it and apply it to your own prophet, including this example of him coming into Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Much the same thing, these palm fronds.
And they were singing, saying, Tala al-Badru alayna, meaning the moon has just appeared, or the light has just appeared, and they changed the name of the city from Yathrib to Medina. Al-Madina al-Munawwara, meaning the city of light.
The city of light. There you go. So you can see there is a concerted effort. There is a concerted effort to get their own narrative. So the biography follows similar stories taken in the Bible of the biblical prophets and transfer them onto Muhammad, especially those of Moses, including the ones of his persecution, followed by an Exodus. There's the Exodus. They want the same thing that Moses had, and then entering Medina. In this case, they're now taking that which happened to Jesus in Jerusalem. This is symptomatic of what you do when you now become the leader. When you become and you now are the new men on the block, the new culture. You need to introduce and aggrandize yourselves and, of course, your man in your book. Let's move then to the next thing, and this has to do with Mecca itself. Well, what about Mecca? What do we know about Mecca? Well, we don't know much about Mecca at all. In fact, it doesn't even exist on any inscription anywhere. And I remember when I was studying under Gerald Hotting in the 1990s. Gerald Hotting introduced Patricia Corona, who I got to know afterwards. And he mentioned, the only reference we have for Mecca does not come until the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Continuata Byzantia Arabica. That is a document that was written in 741. 741 is the 8th century. Muhammad died in 632. You're talking about over 100 years later. You find this document that refers to this city, Mecca. Now, Patricia Crone made this a big thing when she wrote her book in 1977 and also in 1987, the Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. And it lists as the first reference we have for this city called Mecca. Yet remember, Mecca is supposedly where Adam and Eve were thrown down to in chapter 7, verse 24,
and
according to the traditions.
Went and everybody.
Yes, right. In chapter 21, verse 51 to 71, that's Abraham is supposedly in the city Mecca, though it doesn't give the name Mecca. So certainly this would be the oldest city in history, which you would not say if Adam and Eve were there.
And it's very important, right? We hear that it was the center for trade.
Okay, well, that's what Montgomery Watt said, and Montgomery Watt brings that in. But if it's the first city in the history of mankind, it's where Abraham went to in 1900 BC, and according to Montgomery Watt, in the last century, he said this is the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. We're going to destroy that in just a bit, in another one of these episodes yet to come. But can you see, obviously, if this is such a great city, if it's the oldest city in the history of mankind, if this is the city that Abraham lived, if this is the center of north, south, east, and west, then why is it that we don't find any reference to it anywhere until 741? Until 741. And I remember hearing this back in 1995, and I was gobsmacked. And I remember asking Gerald Hutty, that is hugely significant. Why does it take him to 741? He says, well, obviously this has not been written down. We just know that there's a... I said at that time, well, this has huge significance. And he didn't want to come to any conclusions. I want to come to conclusions. What I didn't know is that Patricia Crone didn't read the whole inscription. You've got to continue on. Don't just read the word Mecca, because it's there in the inscription. That's the first reference to the city of Mecca. Look and see what it says about Mecca. Look and see where it places it. Let's go back to the slide again. Now let's just read it. So I'm not going to read the first part of it, but let's come to the word Mecca there. As they consider it the home of Abraham, which lies in the desert between Ur of the Chaldeans, that's the magicians, and Kara, the city of Mesopotamia. What she wasn't, and this is something that I have to fault Patricia Crone, she wasn't paying attention to that second part. Mel really helped me out with this. Mel from Sneakers Corner. He said, Jay, take a look and see where that is. And I said, well, for Abraham, well, that's way over in Iraq. He says, no. That may be in Iraq today, but it was not in Iraq in the 8th century when this was written, 741. Where did all the people in the 8th century believe Abraham came from? Oh, they believed he came from Ur. That's right. Where is Ur in the 8th century? Ur in the 8th century is way up in southern Turkey. Look at that. Let's go back to that slide again and look and see where Ur is. Ur is right there as what is Edessa. That is where Edessa is today. So this inscription written in the 8th century in 741 places Mecca, the city of Mecca, halfway between Edessa and Haran. Look where Edessa and Haran is. That's even further north. That's way up in southern Turkey. Right. Why did Patricia Crone figure this out? Because she thought that this must have been Iraq. Why? Because she didn't realize, or she must have realized, maybe she had a bad day, that the reason why we know that Ur is in Iraq today is because of a British 8th century, the J.E. Taylor, who in the 1800s, that's the 19th century, discovered it. He was a British explorer, and he discovered the modern-day Ur, or what we now know today as Ur, in southern Iraq. But that was 1853. This is 741. This is 1,000 years later, over 1,000 years later, it took to find where Ur is. And that's why she wasn't thinking this through. So the people then assumed it was near Edessa, just south of, and between Edessa and Haran, the town of Abraham. Now, in 697, there's an inscription near Taif. Taif is just southeast of Mecca, up in the plateau, that indicates the building called the Al-Masjid al-Haram, referring to the Kaaba, Al-Masjid al-Haram. Isn't that interesting? This is close to the place that later became known as Mecca or the Hijaz, but it wasn't yet called Mecca. Take a look and see where Taif is. Take a look and see where the modern-day Mecca is, and you will see that it's directly south of this Mecca that's way up there in southern Turkey, which is between Ur and Haran. As we look at the artifacts, as we put ourselves back into in this case, the 8th century, 741, even the Mecca that they have there is in the wrong place. It's much too far north, and it's the wrong Mecca. So where in the world did they get the present-day Mecca? How did this come into being? Hold on to that. We're going to get to that. That's yet to come up on another episode. But I just wanted to bring that in. Can you see? The more we scratch, the more we find. Go ahead. What happens after the more we find? The more we find, the more we shine. What happens next? The more we shine, the more they whine, no, how sublime. Muslims do not like us to do the scratching around. If we don't scratch, then the rocks are going to cry out for us. We need to look at the rocks. That inscription that was written, that is dated to 697, we know that because it dates it from 622. It gives it an exact year from 697, 72 years later. It now was actually pictured on Islamic Awareness website. That inscription has now been destroyed as of last year because they were going public with it. And I think they're realizing that they are having a problem here. I will say this. When Gibson wanted to find out what's happening in Mecca, when Gibson wanted to go and see what archaeological discoveries they're finding in Mecca, because if it's the oldest history in humanity, if it's where Abraham lived in 1900 BC, if it's the center of trade north, south, east, and west, then somehow we should be able to find some artifacts there. And they're building all these tall towers. They're building the fourth highest tower in the world, the clock tower that's there.
Right.
That has been built. And when you build towers that big, that are the fourth highest in the world, you've got to dig deep. You've got to put in foundations. So therefore, the archaeologists are there. And he went to a meeting of archaeologists about 3 years ago, and he asked them, what have you found? And they just kind of looked at him and said, we haven't found a thing except for an Ottoman fort that was built in the 1300s, in the 14th century. Nothing earlier has been found. What does that suggest to you?
It suggests that we're having just a dreamland, not filled with facts or factual things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to get in another episode coming up as to what and why they had to build Mecca down there. What's going on? Again, you need to look at history. History answers that question, but not now. That's for another episode.
Amen. Thank you, brother, as always. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Now you can see why this series has been really exciting and interesting, and hopefully you've been tracking with us up until this point. Until we meet again next time, have a blessed day. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. We can't make these quality videos without the help of partners like you. So please consider becoming a Patreon supporter today at patreon.com/Sira International. I want to make sure you always get notified when we release a new video. So please click the bell to be notified, and of course, make sure to subscribe to this channel. If this video was helpful to you, please click the thumbs up. Thank you.